Mesdames et Messieurs, chers invités, that is all I'm going to say in French. I want to preface my speech with a warning that when I reread my remarks, I realized that some of the things I'm going to say in the beginning are quite shocking. And many of you may be, wondering about how condensed I'm putting the picture together, but I felt that it was necessary to show the grave dangers in which the world is finding itself, to motivate all the more the need to go in a different direction and to have a new paradigm in world politics. So please stay with me and be hopeful that there is a solution to what I'm saying, but without looking very clearly in the eyes of the danger, I don't think we will be able to find an adequate solution. So let me start with the obvious question one should ask in France today. What would Charles de Gaulle do to safeguard the French nation and to protect the French people from the unprecedented dangers in the world today, looking at the twin threat of getting drawn into a potentially nuclear confrontation between the United States and Russia on the one side, and the immediate possibility of a meltdown of the financial system of the transatlantic sector on the other side. That meltdown would obviously throw much of the world into an economic chaos that, if it would happen, also in very likelihood would end up in a global war. The question, therefore, is it 1 second before or already 1 second after 12? When, for example, the German economic Foreign Minister Steinmeier says that he no longer can exclude a direct military confrontation between the United States and Russia. The German foreign minister saying this, I find quite shocking. When at the same time, the American Vice President Biden announced a cyber attack on Russia for an alleged intervention of Russia into the American election, which Konstantin Kosakhov, the head of the Federation Council Committee of International Affairs, called the greatest threat since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And when the spokeswoman of the Russian Defense Ministry, Maria Zakharova, basically accused Washington to pursue a policy of scorched earth in the relationship between Russia and the United States. And when at the 7th Xiangshan Forum in Beijing, Russian and military leaders are warning that the Obama administration is far advanced in preparing its forces for a first nuclear strike against both nations based on the prompt global strike doctrine and the deployment of anti-ballistic missile systems along the Russian and Chinese border, to deliver a surprise missile nuclear strike in any region of the world without punishment. With other words, without the other nation having a second strike capability, and that therefore Russia and China would be forced to take appropriate countermeasures. The fact that Chancellor Merkel has invited President Putin, who did not come to Paris today to open the new Russian Cultural Center, for a summit in Berlin to meet with the so-called Normandy 4 on the question of Ukraine, is obviously a sign of hope. Now, this strategic crisis is obviously heated up by the threatening collapse of the financial sector of the transatlantic world. Deutsche Bank, with 42 trillion outstanding derivative contracts, a sum which is 12 times as big as the annual GDP of the entire German economy on an annual basis, for which almost all the too-big-to-fail banks are counterparties, is only the most riskiest bank. But in the case of a crash, all the big and even the middle-sized banks are dramatically undercapitalized and therefore are in danger of disintegrating. It is quite ironic that of all things, it is maybe the fine which the US Department of Justice gave to Deutsche Bank for its criminal manipulation of the real estate market in 2007, 2008, which caused the systemic crisis of Lehman Brothers, could now be the straw that breaks the camel's back in terms of the insolvency of Deutsche Bank. The presently discussed partial takeover of Deutsche Bank by some of the leading DAX firms in Germany without a write-down of the derivatives would not change anything, because the whole transatlantic banking system is completely bankrupt. As a formerly leading banker told me a couple of weeks ago, that if the storm breaks loose, those who have earned their life earnings through productive work will be the big losers. And if the dams will break, despite all the efforts by the governments to contain the situation, we will experience a different Europe, a breakdown of law and order, ungovernability in the European Union, in short, a continent in revolution. Since we are dealing with the named dangers as the result of human policies, it is absolutely possible to overcome them by choosing an entirely different political course. Franklin D. Roosevelt overcame in 1933 the financial crisis and depression with the Glass-Steagall banking separation law, a law which was introduced in France exactly in the form of a financial reform law which completely separated, completely separated the commercial and the investment banks. Now, at that time, Roosevelt also established something called the Pecora Commission, which put the criminals of Wall Street in front of courts and many of them into jail. And he also returned to a credit policy of the first Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, Alexander Hamilton. My husband, the US economist Lyndon LaRouche, has proposed in that tradition 4 fundamental laws which would lead the US economy out of the present crisis and re-establish the lost productivity of the economy. Apart from introducing the banking separation law, Glass-Steagall, it involves the creation of a national bank, an international credit system in the tradition of Hamilton, and as well as a science driver program for the world economy, as it would be possible with a crash program for fusion technology and an international cooperation for space, science, and travel. If the responsibles of the transatlantic region can be won over in the short term, that is, the leadership of Germany, France, Italy, the United States, and so forth, the world can be brought suddenly away from the abyss. Because largely uncommented by the mass media in the West, in the last 3 years, there has been an unprecedented strategic realignment among nations which have created a completely new option for world politics. Chinese President Xi Jinping has created since 3 years, with the new Silk Road, the One Road, One Belt, One Road economic initiative, a completely new perspective on the agenda, which has in the meantime created an enormous dynamic of economic cooperation of more than 70 countries. China has itself created in the past 40 years an economic miracle, which has been admired by the whole world, and which was interestingly created on the basis of the same economic principles on which the German economic miracle was based in the post-war period, and for which the 40 years China needed, the industrialized nations needed almost 200 years to arrive at the same degree of industrialization. China was able to establish itself in several categories as a world market leader, such as fast train systems, digitalization of industry, electronics, alternative energies, and it lifted in that period 800 million people out of poverty. China just called in a new white paper on the world to overcome extreme poverty for the whole world until 2020. With the construction of the new Silk Road, China is offering all cooperating nations the export of the China model on the basis of a win-win cooperation, with the same focus on innovation and economic growth, which China emphasized as the leader of the G20 summit in Hangzhou in China early September. China has offered the states along the economic belt a comprehensive plan for scientific cooperation, joint laboratories, research centers, tech transfer centers, science and technology parks, an exchange program for 150,000 science and technology personnel from those countries for training in China, and more than 5,000 young scientists with the specific aim to uplift the productivity of the relevant people. At the G20 summit, China pledged to share the benefits of innovation, especially with the developing countries, not to delay the overcoming of their development. The project of the new Silk Road is the largest infrastructure and industrialization program that ever existed on the planet. 17 nations, and that number is growing, which represent 4.4 billion people, and the done and planned investments are in the scope of $1.4 trillion in today's buying power. And this already represents 43% of the world economy. The perspective of the new Silk Road and maritime Silk Road of the 21st century is a development strategy designed for the next 30 and 40 years. As the ancient Silk Road, a name only given by the German geologist Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877, is not just one continuous trade route between Eurasia and Africa, but it is a synonym for the unification and transformation of the different landlocked regions and nations connected by sea road. It is not only transport and exchange of goods, but more importantly, the exchange of scientific knowledge, technologies, and culture. Between President Xi Jinping and President Putin, the basis was laid for the economic integration of the new Silk Road and the Eurasian Economic Union. At the Economic Forum in Vladivostok at the beginning of September, in which Japanese Prime Minister Abe and South Korean President Park participated with very large business delegations, the integration of the Eurasian economic space was advanced decisively, almost not noticed in the Western media. Immediately following the G20 summit organized by China in Hangzhou, which demonstrated to the whole world that China has developed the most progressive model for a new orientation of the world economy based on innovation and economic growth, as well as the reaffirmation of international relations based on the UN Charter and respect for sovereignty and respect for the different social models, which obviously is in stark contrast to concepts such as right to protect and the so-called humanitarian interventions, where we can see the horrible consequences of in Southwest Asia and Northern Africa. President Xi was extremely direct at the G20. He said, the old model is no longer sustainable. We need an innovation-based strategy. We will be the avant-garde in science and technology and do basic research to overcome those scientific and technological problems which are hampering the economic and industrial development. We will speed up the application of science and development, sponsor strategic and rising branches in order to bring industries up to a medium to high level in the value chain. At the immediately following Laos summit of all ASEAN states, they supported the Chinese position in the conflict around the South China Sea and emphasized in their common declaration that China's development represents an important chance for the region and that they explicitly are supporting China's peaceful development. The just concluded BRICS summit in Goa, India, the BRICS state demonstrated that the strategic alliance between Russia, China, and India is the core of the Asian integration, putting common interest above remaining tensions. This rapid sequence of fora and summits within only 6 weeks, in which an enormous amount of economic deals was concluded, highlighted not only the extreme tempo of the strategic realignment in international relations, it also makes clear in an unmistakable fashion that the center of world politics has shifted very clearly to Asia. After the first pilot train came 5 years ago from China, in the meantime, 20 cargo trains arrive per week between the economic centers of China, such as Shenyang, Lianyungang, Harbin, Yiwu, Wuhan, Chengdu, and Chongqing, to the different destinations in Europe, Duisburg, Hamburg, Rotterdam, Lyon, Madrid. The Eastern and Central European states have long recognized the advantages of Chinese investment in exactly those infrastructure projects and transport corridors which in part had been decided at the 1994 conference in Crete by the European Union transport ministers, but which were never realized due to the austerity policy of the Troika of the EU. The modernization of the harbor of Piraeus, the construction of railway lines from Greece via Serbia, Hungary, and beyond, the connection of the Oder-Elbe-Danube channel to the European waterway networks are underway. The governments of Greece, Serbia, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Italy, Portugal, and Swiss have long recognized that the road to the future lies in the cooperation with China and in building the new Silk Road. At the same time, a completely new banking system has been created, which is entirely devoted to investment in infrastructure projects of the real economy and innovation. The AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, where despite significant pressure from Washington, immediately about 70 countries joined as founding members, even close allies of the United States, such as Great Britain, Germany, France, Japan, Australia, and Canada, as well as then you have the New Development Bank of the BRICS, the Maritime Silk Road Fund, the Maritime Silk Road Fund, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Bank, or the Contingency Reserve Arrangement devoted to counter speculative attacks, are all abstaining from the casino economy of the transatlantic sector. All the cities and regions which are involved with exchange of goods along these new trade routes, such as Lyon, recognize very clearly the advantages of cooperation for both sides. What should therefore hold back Europe to fully take up China's offer for a win-win cooperation to extend the new Silk Road to East and Central Europe, the Balkans, Southern Europe, and before all, to reconstruct the war-torn Middle East and to engage in the urgently necessary industrialization of Africa, and thus realize the only policy which can prevent an even more horrible getting out of hand of the refugee crisis? The answer is obvious. the United States administration and Great Britain insist on an unipolar world, which in this form already has ceased to exist. The transatlantic world is about to crash with full speed into the Thucydides trap, the ancient fear of essence of the rise of Sparta, of which former US Joint Chief of Staff General Martin Dempsey has warned repeatedly. And Europe has been up to now caught in the old paradigm to adjust to Washington consensus without asking many questions. A report released on the 12th of September by the Said Business School of Oxford University is symptomatic for the obviously as futile as desperate efforts by the proponent of the decaying neoliberal monetarist school to try to discredit the enormous success of the new Silk Road policy. The report argues ridiculously that the enormous investment in infrastructure, 10.8 trillion in the last decade alone, is the cause for the pending collapse of the Chinese economy and a threat to the entire world economy. This typical view, shared by the philosophy of high risk and high profit investment in banking, that investment in infrastructure does not produce high yield of return, has been correctly mocked by Chinese officials who have stated, "We assess risk differently than Western agencies because we look at the potential for the development of a country. They look backward, we look forward." The history of industrialization of every country on the planet is plain proof that the development of infrastructure is the conditio qua non for the transformation into modern economies. The return on the individual projects cannot be measured in terms of the profit directly coming from this project, such as, for example, the toll for private highways, but in terms of the increase of the productivity of the entire nation or continent caused by the improved connectivity of industry, agriculture, mobility of individuals, and so forth. The more developed and dense the infrastructure development of a country is, including as infrastructure, power, water, communication, education, healthcare, and so forth, the higher the productivity of the economy, the living standard, the longevity of the people. Naturally, the Oxford researchers, being British, can't help than letting the cat out of the bag. They warn other developing countries, such as Pakistan, Nigeria, or Brazil, not to take China as the model for their development, which they are already doing. Equally wrong and misguided and guided by geopolitical motives is the argument that China is simply trying to replace Anglo-American imperialism with its own Chinese version. These assertions are nothing but projections of their own mindset of those who make the argument. The reality is that on top of the 2,500 years old tradition of Confucianism, there is a profound renaissance of Confucianism occurring in China, which puts the ideal of individual lifelong self-perfection forward, and that of a harmonious development of all nations, which absolutely corresponds to China's win-win policy of the new Silk Road in the mutual interest of everybody participating in it, and to the idea to share the fruits of innovation and scientific and technological progress, especially with the developing countries. There is a much deeper affinity between Confucianism and the European humanist tradition than almost anybody is aware of today. The problem is not China. The problem is that we in Europe have moved away from our most noble traditions, such as the Italian Renaissance, the French École Polytechnique, the German classical period, and the optimistic image of man associated with them. We have allowed them to be replaced with the depravity of the present-day popular culture, dominated by ugliness, violence, pornography, and shallowness. Therefore, to come back to the question I posed in the beginning, what would Charles de Gaulle do today? I'm certain that he would passionately embrace the idea finally overcoming poverty and underdevelopment through the global extension of the new Silk Road to become a world land bridge, and that in the new paradigm there will be not a contradiction between being a patriot and a world citizen concerned with the well-being of the entire human species. Let me remind you of the extraordinary speech de Gaulle gave in his address to the German youth on the 9th of September 1962 in Ludwigsburg, where he talked about that dark power which, on the basis of an unknown law, causes material things of life to undergo ever more rapid transformations, and that the totality of scientific discoveries causes a continuous improvement of the physical conditions of life. De Gaulle said, the wonderful perspective which presents itself to you, talking to the young Germans, should, through those who are of your age, not be limited to a few chosen ones, but become accessible for all our companions. You should drive that progress becomes a common good, so that it contributes to the fostering of the beautiful, the just, and the good. Everywhere, and especially in our countries, which represent our civilization and therefore can contribute to the billions living in the developing countries to conquer hunger, misery, ignorance, and achieve their full human dignity. What we in the European nations have to do is to define in de Gaulle's spirit our true self-interest, that is to use the rich scientific and cultural tradition of 2,500 years of European history to join with the hopeful perspective that the new Silk Road represents, and work together to bring mankind into an entirely new paradigm, which proceeds from the notion that the one humanity is of a higher order than all its diversities. We must agree on the common aims of mankind because we are indeed what Xi Jinping calls a community of shared destiny, a community of shared future of mankind. What are these common aims? We should join hands to industrialize Africa through the extension of the new Silk Road, so that the millions now tortured by poverty and war no longer feel the need to take the risk of dehydration in the desert or drown in the Mediterranean trying to come to Europe. We should fulfill our moral obligation to reconstruct the war-torn countries of the Middle East, because it was the West which contributed to this horror. We should make sure that all the children of the planet have access to universal education, so that the limitless creative potential of the human species can be set free. We can and must make new scientific revolutions and concerning the principles of life, the creativity of the human mind as a physical power in the universe, and the lawfulness governing our universe at large. Let's assume the world outlook of our astronauts, cosmonauts, and taikonauts looking down from space on our small, fragile blue planet and looking out into the far ranges of our universe, solar system, and galaxy. Because spacefarer and research has an unbelievable power to cause man to ask questions he never asked before, and to discover principles we do not even know to ask the right question about. Let us become truly human, and we will conquer all challenges with the beginning of a new era of mankind.